assuming congressional obstacles and public skepticism can be overcome, those are relatively large assumptions, at least sometime in the next 5 to 10 years, let me suggest 4 big steps that the United States should take, in my view at least, to restore and reform its historic relations with Latin America. So I'll tell you what the 4 are, and then I'll come back to discuss each of them in excruciating detail. First, the United States needs to find a way to overcome the historic legacy of unilateralism and intervention that keeps inter-American institutions weak, underfunded, and ineffective so that they can be ignored and circumvented whenever convenient. Second, the United States should make a credible, mutually beneficial, and therefore massive commitment to human development in Latin America, without which constructive policies of freer trade, deregulation, and fiscal discipline are likely to fail. Third, the United States should open its borders to a freer flow of labor from its NAFTA partners and offer similar advantages to other Western Hemisphere free trade partners. And finally, just in case these weren't enough, the United States really must abandon its counterproductive war on drug trafficking and substitute a war on arms trafficking. So let me try to provoke you further by elaborating on each of these 4 items in my wish list. Economic growth in the 21st century will mean greater inter-American as well as global economic integration. Integration will bring enormous benefits from freer flows of information, technology, capital, labor, goods and services across national borders. Achieving these benefits, however, will require a more predictable, efficient, and secure institutional environment. This means more powerful international legal and judicial institutions, new or better mechanisms for coordinating monetary and financial policies, new taxation and enforcement mechanisms, and tough new international regulatory standards for labor, health, and the environment. We cannot build these kinds of international economic institutions in a climate of international insecurity and lawlessness. Unilateralism is the unspoken, but sometimes politically rewarding practice of pursuing apparent U.S. interests in ways that circumvent or subvert inter-American and international organizations, or in extreme cases, violate treaty obligations and international legal norms. Unilateralism became the hallmark of U.S. policy in Latin America, particularly in the Caribbean, more than a century ago. During the 20th century, the United States invaded and occupied all of 9 sovereign nations, some of them repeated: Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Grenada, Haiti, Honduras, Guatemala, Mexico, Nicaragua, and Panama. That's almost half of the members of the OAS. Between 1898 and 1994, the United States succeeded in overturning a total of at least 41 sitting governments in Latin America, approximately 1 every 28 months. 12 of the governments overturned by exertions of U.S. power had been installed by popular vote in competitive elections. The others were sort of substituting one colonel for another, or one general for his cousin. This is an appalling record. Although U.S. policymakers have always cited laudable motives, various laudable motives, to justify each decision, historians have been hard-pressed to find any real threats to U.S. security of the sort that treaties and international legal norms require for such actions. The long-term effect of unilateral interventionism has been to condemn inter-American institutions, which the United States has often helped to create, to irrelevance or extinction. The U.S. preference for free hand to deal with mostly hypothetical dangers has closed off, in my view, real opportunities to promote economic growth through more powerful and effective inter-American legal, judicial, regulatory, and financial institutions. The United States today faces no actual or even potential strategic challenges from Latin America, if it ever did. And non-strategic threats, such as terrorism, cannot be diminished or averted by preemptive unilateral intervention and acts of war. In such a context, it should be reasonably easy to make a pledge of non-intervention credible through a formal agreement. An agreement to refer all decisions on military action, economic embargoes and sanctions, and other warlike interventions to some body that the United States does not control, like the United Nations Security Council. There is one precedent for this, significantly in the post-Cold War era. For the first time since the founding of the UN, and after 19 interventions that overthrew governments in Latin America, beginning with the 1954 overthrow of an elected government in Guatemala, and ending with the series of military overthrows that occurred during the latter period of the Cold War, for the first time, the United States in 1994 went to the Security Council and sought permission before it ousted a military junta and restored the elected president of Haiti. It's the only precedent. International commitments, nonetheless, are notoriously difficult to police and impossible to enforce against superpowers. But superpowers can make their commitments credible, even if not absolute, by creating or supporting international institutions with the power to impose costs, such as automatic exclusion from some well-defined set of economic or institutional benefits. A U.S. commitment to a new and credible, more credible, good neighbor policy would produce two benefits right away. First, in the specific case, it would require the United States to end its 40-some-year embargo on trade and travel to Cuba and begin looking for constructive ways to engage Cuba within the framework of a revitalized inter-American system. And second, more generally, it would help to protect U.S. policymakers from domestic political pressures to intervene militarily or through local proxies when, as in the past, there is no good reason to do so. With the clutter and resentments generated by past interventions beginning to fade, the United States should then try to rediscover its long ago and fleeting interest in economic development and social progress throughout the hemisphere. The promise of the Alliance for Progress, announced by President Kennedy in 1961, quickly turned into the grotesque nightmare of military rule that enveloped the region from the 1960s into the 1980s. The United States should return to the abandoned promise of the Alliance for Progress now. If the U.S. government would make human development its top priority, mutually beneficial economic integration would be much easier to achieve. The United States now exports more to Latin America than to the European Union or to China. 2/3 of this trade is with Mexico. The greatest potential for future growth in the next decade or two may lie further south. For example, Brazil has the largest economy in the region, but its trade with the United States is tiny in comparison with Mexico. Unfortunately, talks to create a free trade agreement in the Americas, FTAA, foundered on U.S. protectionism and the U.S. insistence during the Bush administration that disputes involving intellectual property rights and similarly thorny issues should be deferred to the Doha round of global trade talks. The 2005 deadline for signing the FTAA passed almost unnoticed. And then the global trade talks collapsed. So the United States and the hemisphere are left without a framework for addressing either economic growth or social progress. That is, without a policy at all.